Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, if only you people knew what went on behind closed doors, what we talked about before this show, but hopefully we can express as much that to you today as we do among each other. Now, of course, that sort of candid conversation cannot be beat, but hopefully we can give you something at least close to that. So, of course, we got a lot of news about out of Afghanistan still. Still ongoing. I mean, get used to it. We'll probably be talking about this through the end of the year at least in some capacity. This is set, in my humble opinion, to surpass the Khashoggi saga. Now, for those of you long timers of the war report, you'll remember we spent like what 8 9 weeks in a row talking about this Saudi journalist who got liquidated in a Turkish consulate. But man, those are old episodes. But with that being said, we shall start with Syria, where this show really began. And it looks like it's been a pretty active week in Syria in light of the chaos in Afghanistan. Now, you could argue those two are connected, but it looks like Syrian government forces and their allies have taken immense advantage of the situation, as well as Turkish forces have taken immense advantage of the situation. And particularly, you look at the Idlib province, you look at where the rebels still control Idlib, it's shrinking further and further, of course, you can see on the map where the Russian Syrian activity has pushed back even further. And everyone is so distracted about the poor nose ring Afghan women that they can't even notice that the last gay bakery in Idlib was blown up by a Russian missile. It's a very sad story, you know. I think this really justifies intervention against Assad, of course, because you know what a brutal tyrant. I can't believe. I mean, people didn't even know what Aleppo was, and you had that poor 8-year-old child of an Al Qaeda lieutenant just telling us why we have to go to World War III over
Yeah,
Syria. But man, I think it does help, all jokes aside, to put all the narratives about Syria into perspective as really we're entering the closing stages of not only Afghanistan but this war as well. I mean, look at the size of the rebel held area in Idlib. But we'll get into it later. There was a bit of a resurgence in Daraa, the cradle of the revolution along the Israeli and Jordanian border. I'm sure that's no coincidence at all, that positioning. But it does look like, of course, you have the main story out of Syria, like I said, is this whole. It truly is the last summer of Idlib, isn't it? And it looks like Turkey has also taken control of this situation, has also turned it into their favor. And this is, of course, after them backing down on their big, oh, we won't get out of Afghanistan, we'll stand up to the Taliban. Of course, that was reneged almost immediately. The normal activity in northeastern Syria, with, of course, the arrest of escaped ISIS fighters and the so called SDF and Kurdish forces in their activities, just very mundane things. We don't get so much of the U.S. patrols getting chased around nowadays. That is strange how that story has dropped off. But yeah, getting into Daraa, it looks like there has been a totally organic protests coming out of there and protesting against the horrible, terrible Syrian regime after all these years. After, again, 10 years, they still have this fight in them. About 3 years after the cradle of the revolution was put down, I remember when we did the episode talking about when Syrian and Iranian backed forces finally moved into Daraa, but it looks like they're trying one last ditch effort right here to, again, just, I wouldn't even say destabilize Syria at this point, well, at least not to the extent of overthrowing a government, but just to have a thorn in their side, just to have something there. Because I think at this point, even the most ardent of Syria hawks, whether they be in Washington, Tel Aviv, Brussels, or just anywhere pretty much in the West or anywhere that was involved in this coalition of trying to get Assad out of power, I think they've more or less given up on that prospect, but are going to, again, try this so-called containment strategy, which we'll get into some of the stuff with Lebanon here in a minute, about, again, just creating chaos on the peripheries of Syria and even just like barely puncturing in through the border if they have to. And I think that's what we're seeing right now with this whole situation in Daraa. Of course, there has been arrest and there's been speculation that they're going to do a much harsher crackdown with possibly deploying some military units for crowd control, riot control, etc., in order to keep everything in order. Now, I'm not even sure what the official reason they gave for the protests were. I'm not even sure like what the narrative was about. Like, I again, I can't even be bothered to keep up with these small things anymore. Truth be told, this may be a bit of a generous estimate, but by next week, this thing will have been swept away and nobody will be talking about it. And it's just one of these desperate attempts to try to spark just even the slightest thing in yet another failed project.
Right. So there's about 100 fighters holed up in the south central portion of Daraa city, very close to the Israeli border or the Golan Heights. These guys, some years back, promised that they would not fight. They apparently had laid down their arms, and that they would reintegrate into society and accept their defeat and so on. Now, one of the things that happened, in the Syrian war was a plan to confine whoever still wanted to fight to one region, and this is Idlib. This is that region in the northwest, bordering the Mediterranean and Turkey. So some of their fighters did end up going there, and of course there were many that were left behind. So I tend to think that this is some kind of a coordinated effort, where the fighters of HTS and Idlib and other affiliates like the Islamic Turkmen Party, and another jihadi group, are there to basically stretch the limits of the Syrians and the Russians. Now, as far as Daraa goes, the main problem has been in how to get these guys removed. It's not a lot of them, but you don't need a lot because, in a sense, urban warfare is extremely difficult, and it suits the defender very much like a castle would suit a defender in the Middle Ages. So Russia's strategy is to sweet talk them out of Daraa, because obviously, if the fighting
Wait, so they're not bombing the
intensifies,
bakeries?
no, no, the woke bakeries are still functioning,
Okay, good.
and um, so Syria, of course, is losing patience with these guys. As we mentioned last week, 5 Syrian soldiers were killed combating them. So it is serious. And um, about 2 weeks ago, it looked like these guys were going to surrender, but then they changed their minds. So it is worse. And what I think Russia is afraid of is that eventually there's going to have to be a bombing campaign to get these guys out. Um, so it's going to have to get far worse before it gets better, and nobody wants that.
And of course, a
But I think
bombing campaign right next to Israel and Jordan, which is
right,
even. I mean, we saw this under the Trump administration, right after, a
yeah,
couple months after his second strikes on Syria, where they did put an end to the rebel forces for the time being in Daraa with Russian aircraft, with Russian forces moving in there, even Iranian
yeah,
backed forces and Iranian forces moving in there. Now, one could wonder what the reaction of a Biden administration would be, of course, with his relative absentee position just in general, and especially in wake of this Afghanistan embarrassment. That could, again, potentially branch off two different ways. The sign of a less engaged, more isolated U.S., or one that is eager to, or I suppose in this case, desperate to prove its credibility in that they can still be taken seriously on the world stage. So we could, again, get the other example where they're very hawkish about this and they're very on top of this. They say, stay away from Israeli airspace or there will be consequences. And who knows what the dynamic with, of course, the Biden administration and Bennett's government in power, because it
right,
seems like literally every factor but Putin and Assad have changed in this war. It is insane because I mean the Iranians they have new leadership. Rouhani is out. Of course, the U.S. has gone through. We're on our third president since the start of the Syrian civil war. You have a new prime minister in Israel. I mean the Jordanians relatively have the same government Erdogan does, but again when it comes from like the U.S. Israeli side, everything has changed. And like, we're not just talking
Yeah.
like a handover of power, we're talking like drastic changes in terms of how these administration functions. Now, of course, I'm not saying that Trump was this big firebrand that he really bucked these trends, but in some ways he did. I will admit. I wouldn't even say on purpose, but just inadvertent ways there were things that changed about this, and it does create this very contentious situation where does this mean we are more or less likely to see chatter about Syria in the event that they actually would have to apply air power or some sort of heavier force on these held out fighters and just on the general civil unrest there?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a tough call. Um, I honestly believe that, like, of course, there is concern about infringing on Israeli airspace, but I don't. I think the bigger concern is um, Russia thinks that it's going forward. It's very bad for a place that's already been conquered to have to be reconquered.
Oh, certainly. I think they would risk um, ruffling the feathers of Israel, not even necessarily violating their airspace. Of course, you know how Israel would get if you come within 100 miles of it, how they get. But I think Putin, especially when he doesn't have this rapport with Bennett that he did with Netanyahu, and just the Russian leadership in general, would be willing to ruffle those feathers, especially in an opportune time like this when, like I said, the United States isn't entirely absent, but the most absent it has been since probably the last 70 years, probably since the entire post war order. This is probably the most retractive they've ever been on the world stage. So it would be very strange to watch them not take advantage of this opportunity and not push those boundaries
Right.
in a situation like this when you figured they'd be much more likely to get away with this than they would even say 2 years ago.
Right, and it's also a question of morale. Uh, the morale of certain Syrians would be frankly diminished, and others, the wrong types, would be emboldened. So that's like, I think they would like to resolve the. It would be better to resolve this quietly, because it would lend the idea to of Assad being not just the rightful leader of the country, but that he can solve the issues without further violence, because this war is now past its 10-year mark.
Oh, of course, it's entering into
And,
its 11th year, and you
and,
do have a point. The
and
fact that if it can be solved through diplomacy and negotiations, it will be a much better, more quote unquote modern look of statecraft versus again just bombing the woke bakeries, so to
yeah,
speak.
right, exactly. And so, um, because if they do, if this really intensifies this, you have the possibility of the war in that area broadening, attracting more insurgents, flipping people over to the other side, because civilians will die if this happens. And on the other hand, you can't leave it as it is, because it makes the government look weak. If if these jihadists go along with it, right, it will make the government look stronger, not weaker, and it will make the jihadis look weaker, not stronger. If that makes sense.
Oh, certainly, and it is one of those things where, like, or again, especially in a state of civil war, sure you do have to apply that brute force, but just to reiterate the point, it has a much different kind of effect when you show that you can really be the truly impartial, above it all sort of party. Not that I'm saying they would get that reputation instantaneously from one negotiation with a rebel group, but again, it would help build towards
Mm-hmm.
the idea that maybe there is some, uh, I guess you could say, non-violent solution. I won't even go as far as call it peaceful, but non-violent solution that doesn't involve again the government marching in and just asserting its control through force of arms, but gaining legitimacy through other means. Now, not that again I'm a big liberal or humanitarian or anything, but if you have to rely purely on force of arms, you have a regime that is not going to last very long. And I think you could look at Syria's neighbor, Iraq, as a prime example of that towards the end, especially once the sanctions kicked in and a lot of people just lost faith in the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein. But I suppose that's all I had for Syria, unless you had any other news items. But I suppose there is a bit of chaos going in Lebanon. Now, of course, it's nowhere near Syria, and a lot of it is the result of a spillover from Syria, and Lebanon is still in a pretty tight economic situation. They're having water shortages, they have shortages of the most basic of goods, and it really looks like just it looks like absolute chaos. It looks like what you call a failed state. Now, I knew things were bad in Lebanon, and that was only accentuated by the explosion at the port last year, which I think took out what were the final estimates on that? About a quarter of their economy still.
Yeah.
And again, you had the international powers very interested at first, especially France, trying to play peacemaker negotiator there. You had some tepid interest of Russia so far as Syria was concerned, but it looks like the French were the main players there, but Macron quickly got out of that when he figured out how intricate Lebanese politics were between all the ethnic and religious groups, so he threw up his hands and left the situation. It seems like, especially since the French have given up on that situation, that really nobody wants to touch it. Whether that be Russia, whether that be Turkey, whether that be the United States, it's just that it seems like, in light of everything else happening with Syria, Afghanistan, even Iran and Iraq, if you want to get that deep into it, it
Hmm.
seems like Lebanon has been left out in the cold and has been given no attention about any of the situation, which I would say is pretty strange considering just its proximity to Syria and especially what still something like 2 million Syrians are still in that country to this day. Some
All right.
astronomical
It's
amount.
unfathomable almost. Like for a country like Lebanon, which is tiny, has a small population, has an economy that's in tatters, and even when it
Demographically
wasn't, it
unstable
was in
as it
terrible
is,
shape.
and then what kind of people do you think they're receiving from Syria? Do you think it fits in with the? I don't even want to say majority because there's no majority, but do you think it even fits in with the plurality group of Lebanon, which are these? Uh, I think the Catholics are still a slight plurality over both the Sunnis and Shias, but I can only imagine that most of the people coming in from Syria are Muslims, and of that, most are probably Sunnis. Now, of course, a lot of people driven out of the country were disproportionately of the minority groups. So, again, like getting Christians, Druze, and like these other groups in there wouldn't be a surprise. But still, tipping the demographic scales like that in a country already as unstable as it is, and we've seen, this is no situation that's new to Lebanon. They took in a lot of Palestinians after, of course, the formation of Israel, and that boiled over until their civil war in the 70s and 80s. So it looks like, I'm not saying Lebanon's going to go to civil war, but it looks like Lebanon is in a state of crisis once again, just by being in the wrong neighborhood, so to speak. And really, I don't know how much longer this we can pretend like Lebanon isn't a failed state, because if this were any country in even North Africa, even if any like North Africa, not even sub-Saharan African country, was functioning like Lebanon did, it would be declared a failed state almost immediately. And I don't know
Yeah.
why the hesitation is pretending like everything is fine, everything is still relatively stable there, when clearly, minus force of arms, minus people taking the streets to shoot at each other, at least in like any organized sort of conflict, and of course just um, petty violence and crime, that sort of stuff is happening right now. But shy of militia groups coming out in the streets to fight each other, you have a failed state in Lebanon, and I really don't know what else you could call it. And I'm not one who thinks that it's the business of the United States or the West or whoever to micromanage these countries, but especially with the situation in Syria, especially with all other things considered, I think it's weird that Lebanon is getting absolutely zero attention. You figured there would at least be the slightest bit of, oh yes, we're aware of the situation in Lebanon, we're monitoring the situation, as a wise man once said. But it does seem like a complete and total media blackout from it. Not only in the Western media, but even go into like Russian or Chinese or Middle East. I suppose there's some in Middle Eastern media, but not nearly as many people are talking about it as you would have expected to.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, some of the projections after the explosion last year was that Lebanon would go into a civil war. Uh, there were basically what I would call some your kind of Western chauvinists that were like had their fingers crossed that that would happen. Um, and I predicted that that wouldn't happen. And
Because nobody wants to
you know,
fire the first shot. Nobody wants to be responsible for starting the Lebanese civil war, which is a case I think we saw in Syria for a while when things started to stall out. Nobody wanted to be responsible for the escalation of the conflict, and I think that's where a lot of these conflicts come to a halt. And again, Nagorno-Karabakh is another one with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Nobody wants to be responsible for having reignited or started the conflict, and I would say that's Lebanon's current state. However, that can deteriorate fast, but I think for the time being, that's still where it stands for all the aforementioned.
yeah, and I think also they have a very recent history of a terrible war, a very long war, very destructive. It took decades to climb out of all of that destruction, particularly in an economic sense. And I think they're terrified that nothing good will come of it, because, like, let's say Lebanon's most prosperous period, without doubt, was before the war, and it's never regained that position since. And so I think they're very wary of what the costs will be. And even Israel's attempted incursions into Lebanon in 2006 did not spark a civil war. The sides that formed during the Lebanese civil war in the 80s didn't repeat themselves. And like I say, I think they're very wary, and I think in many ways the major groups there have learned in a way to get along because the consequences are so far, far worse.
And especially with the outbreak and spillover of Syria, I think that takes, at least for the immediate future, the possibility of civil war or conflict in Lebanon pretty clearly off the table. I don't think that many parties in Lebanon, whether that be Hezbollah, whether that be whatever Sunni groups are there, whether that be the
Mm-hmm.
so-called diversity coalition government, which of course, for those of you who don't know, Lebanon does have certain quotas where the president has to be of one religious affiliation, prime minister of another, head of parliament of another, and no party can control like more than 1/3 of it. It's this very precarious system made to try to accommodate all of these very disparate groups, but that's also the question of what you do like with a country like that, because balkanization might be a viable solution if you weren't the size of Lebanon, because you just end up with a
Yeah,
bunch of literal microstates. We're talking like countries that are,
yeah,
yeah, like smaller than like some of these countries that came out of the former Yugoslavia, like smaller than Macedonia or like Montenegro, or
yeah.
dare I
We're
even
we're
say
we're we're
Kosovo.
talking like Liechtenstein,
Oh yeah, like Liechtenstein,
like tiny states.
yeah, like Luxembourg, those kind of countries, like if not smaller. It's
Yeah,
like and you could think like, oh, partitions, but like could you, and I mean with how contentious things have been between Lebanon and Syria, especially like with Syrian intervention in the civil war, could you imagine trying to divvy up like, oh, this would go to X country, this would go to Y country? Like really, the only solution I would say for Lebanon is somebody has to be it has to be a protectorate of somebody is the only way I could really see it functioning. Now, whether that be,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
of course, its historical patron, France. Of course, France was its colonial master and served in that role more or less into the Civil War, of course, in a de facto sense. Some people would say Russia with its current involvement in Syria, and you saw Russia make some overtures that way and have been trying to ease their way into Lebanese internal politics, I would say, since the outbreak of Syria. One would think, and of course, Israel is going to try to take control of the situation. Erdogan has been ambitious. I believe he said a few things about Lebanon. But point being is, I see, and of course there's the Iranians with the Shias, but the logistics of that would have to like be the perfect storm with the calming of the situation in both Iraq and Syria for Iran to be a reliable, again, patron, so to speak, for Lebanon to be a
Mm.
client of Iran. But again, the only way I could see any solution to this conflict, because again, balkanization, partition, that isn't going to work. The status quo isn't going to work. Civil war clearly isn't going to work. Is that they're I could be proven completely wrong, but it seems like they are destined to fall to be a client state of some either regional or major power. Now,
Yeah.
if I had to put my money on somebody, I would say it's either going to be Turkey or Russia, because I think they're the only ones who would really want to embark on that project. And I think Russia would only be interested in so far as it would affect Syria, which, who knows, as the situation deteriorates in Lebanon, it could start to threaten Russian interests in Syria, in which case we could see more serious involvement there. I don't know, maybe the Gulf states, maybe Saudi Arabia, even though, I mean, Saudi Arabia, the
Yeah.
Gulf states, the UAE, they've taken quite the blow of credibility with this whole Yemen debacle to the point where they even tried peace negotiations after their brutal war in Yemen. I know the UAE has been trying to be this big power player in Middle Eastern politics lately. Maybe they'll try to do something, even though I believe it was Mohammed bin Salman during his initial rise to power kidnapped Hariri, who was the prime minister of Lebanon at the time, and he still might be prime minister. Again, it's such a revolving door system there. I can't even keep up with who's in power over there anymore. But point being is, like, out of these regional powers, or one of the major powers, I really see no future forward for Lebanon as a quote unquote independent country. I think it's just a question of, okay, who's going to be in charge of keeping things at least semi orderly and semi functional there. And I think that's what it really comes down to. And I wouldn't have a guess on that. I would say, like, again, Turkey seems to be the only one that's really ambitious enough. We'll see how the French act. We'll see how, again, maybe Macron will try to do the Emperor LARP thing as he always does. Or, of course, the Gulf states. But again, that brings back a situation where I can just name these countries over and over, and I don't know which one's the most likely or whatever, because it's just still so circumstantial. And I don't see the situation internally improving on its own. Again, I think it's one of those situations where somebody is going to have to enforce a sort of order there. Now, do I think that will require boots on the ground? Not necessarily. I doubt it. I doubt any country wants to, again, directly intervene in that, especially after what happened to the U.S. troops when, I mean, I know that was like 35, 40 years ago, but especially for Western countries, that memory is still probably pretty fresh. You still hear people talking about the barrack bombings to this day. And again, I don't see many countries that would be willing to commit troops there, or even the Lebanese willing to post troops. So again, it just brings us back to this roadblock to the point. I guess we'll just have to wait and see who gets stuck with the bill for cleaning up this mess.
Yeah. I think in many ways, Hezbollah is keeping to some degree some of the integrity of Lebanon. And what I mean by this is, um, like, I don't think Hezbollah has made Lebanon a satellite of Iran. It's used for it, but the fact is, the space, the physical space, and even the mental space of Lebanon is, let's say, for lack of a better word, libertarian. That is, it's very dynamic, and it's who controls what is very, um, let's say, spotted. It's
Yeah, very
not,
tribalized, so to speak.
yeah, and it's not centralized by any means, but it isn't a state that, again, except for maybe Iran, is not a state that's being used as a club or a bludgeon against another
But
state.
even the Iranian Hezbollah relationship is sort of that of you scratch my back, I scratch yours, where of course
Yes,
Iran will
yes,
provide these funds and provide these things for them. Hezbollah will do favors for them, but really beyond, again, pro-Iranian and pro-Shia sentiments, you don't see much direct Iranian influence, say, as you do in somewhere like Syria or Iraq or Yemen. Uh, I'm
yeah,
sure the Iranians would like further influence in Lebanon. Don't get me wrong, but for the time
yes,
being, it seems like more of a a two-way street, so to speak, where yeah, sure, there's influence, but it's not undue influence. It's not like complete puppeteering of this group or this country. And like I said, they share a lot of common goals. I don't think they'd be enemies in the absence of, say, Israel or again any or the United States or Saudi Arabia or whatever. I think they'd still have common interests. But point being is, it's not the warm fuzzy or the even puppeteering relationship that it gets portrayed as. And yeah, because if it was, I think Lebanon, for better or for worse, under Hezbollah rule, would be a much more stable place. It'd be clear who was in charge. It'd be clear who is running the show. But right now, I think that without that, again, it's sort of a very polarized, stratified country, if you will. Getting down into the ethnic, religious differences, where it is almost like Afghanistan. You go from one village and town to the other. People are speaking complete different dialect, have completely different culture, completely different religion, way of life, etc. But that's all I had about Lebanon. Just this situation that's really just brewing under the
I,
surface that it seems like has gotten no attention at all.
hmm The only thing I have to add to Lebanon is that the Beirut Bar Association, I forget the name of the lawyer leading the charge, but they are suing Savaro Limited. This is the UK based company that was storing the ammonium nitrate, 2,750 tons of it, at the port. So they are suing them for the explosion, claiming that it was not being looked after properly. It was that the storage was the way it was stored was inadequate, and so that's an. I mean, that's it's still very early on. It was literally just announced this week, but I find it interesting because uh, back last year, a lot of people were making claims that it was a munitions depot, and I think this court case, if we follow it closely, we'll find out if that was really the case or not.
Oh, certainly. And again, I think that it may raise a lot more question than it answers, but I still think it will be certainly interesting to see the outcome of that. But moving on to some brief European news, Nord Stream 2 is in its final stages. I would say by the end of the week it should be complete, despite some crying from some German courts. Now, again, people predict that that might delay it, but again, it was projected to be completed on Monday, the 23rd, but that deadline had been missed. The anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It would have been such a foreboding sign if it would have been approved. Then maybe that's why they pushed it back. Maybe Putin's thinking about this whole 4D chess. Hitler conquers the world and whatever. You know how they spin those narratives. But point being
Yes.
is, barring literally final touches, I would say by the end of this week, by September 1st, Nord Stream 2 will be a 100% complete project. It looks like,
hmm
again, it's it's been over for a while, I would say, since sometime last year, if not even before, maybe like late 2019, would have been the point of no return of stopping Nord Stream 2. And they tried their damnedest. And funny enough, Trump was actually much more assertive on this issue than Biden. Perhaps the Biden administration realized that the fight just wasn't worth it at this point, so they might as well learn to live with it, which I think is probably what happened. And of course, Merkel is saying, "Oh, we're fine with the energy cooperation with Russia. We're fine with economic deals, but tisk tisk tisk, Russia must not weaponize this gas." And of course, this is typical of the German-Russian relationship, where they will pursue these economic endeavors together, but still keep up this Cold War rhetoric of, well, of course we're on opposite sides of the spectrum. Of course we're enemies. Now, how much of that is a stage act on both sides, I don't know. How much of it is Germany just saying what it needs to keep the U.S. at bay versus how much of it do they actually believe? But point being is, words aside, it looks like in action and what is actually happening, Nord Stream 2 has been complete with very little protest from the United States, from most of Europe or the EU. Now, of course, there is the occasional crying, but in terms of people who would actually be able to do anything, even issue symbolic statements, it has been, again, almost completely quiet from them, if not outright. I can't think of any real major condemnation. even the American neoconservative establishment isn't going off about this in the way that you would have expected them to, in the way that they have been for the past several months, past year. And really, I think what we're seeing here, especially once it is officially done, a really new chapter of inter-European politics, and
Yeah.
especially in regard with their cooperation with Russia. Now, of course, that is in the lead up to the German election, the lead up to the French election, of course, other minor European countries, but I mean, France and Germany are the big ones here that we're talking about. The more or less sidelining of Ukraine because really, I mean, nobody cares about what's going on in Ukraine now. Very few people care about what's going on in Ukraine now, to the point where, again, after losing Crimea, as much as they complain or raise a ruckus about that, they're not going to do anything, even symbolically. Of course, they'll issue their statements, but there hasn't been any additional sanctions, at least particularly about that. There hasn't been any of these official condemnations that you would have expected to see, say, 3 or 4 years ago. And I think, at least from an economic standpoint, much of the European Union has learned to accept Russia as something that is there to stay. Now, of course, politically or geopolitically or culturally, they may be at odds with Russia, but I think from an economic and energy standpoint, though those two things in particular, they've more or less learned to accept the fact of life that nothing is really changing anytime soon. It's going to take something major, and really, it wouldn't be worth it to rock this boat just to get one over on the Russians, which I think has been, especially after the past decade of U.S. policy, especially post Crimea, has been a mentality a lot of Europeans have come to, at least from my personal interaction with them and just looking at the way these countries conduct themselves. Now, of course, even in the countries where you have the strong nationalistic rhetoric, especially targeted towards Russia, like in Poland and in some of these Eastern European countries, it stops there. It's just rhetoric. Now, of course, they'll get angry when anyone insinuates that maybe they should bridge the gap with the Russians and try to improve relations, such as, again, Poland is the one you mainly think about this, but how many sanctions efforts or condemnation efforts are spearheaded by Poland? Poland is usually somebody who tags along to whatever American, British, or German or French initiative is put forward. You don't see Poland really spearheading many, if any at all, of these initiatives, and I do think that is rather indicative of where Europe is. Of course, they will blow hot air all day. All the parties involved will go home and do their posturing and play up to their populations, play up to their national sentiments. But at the end of the day, they've more or less learned to accept this is the way things just need to be economically for the time being, for the foreseeable future. At least that's the attitude I'm getting from this. Now, I could be completely wrong. If we have any Europeans out there, just let me know what the situation is on the ground in your country or whatever your government's doing. But that's the way, just looking at it across the pond and just looking at the different media sources, whether that be American, British, German, French, Russian, etc. That's what seems to be the final result of this whole thing after, several years of fighting and debating and complaining and saber rattling and posturing, that it looks like this is the end outcome, which in our reality is pretty plain, pretty boring, some may say, but overall, in terms of the real situation on the ground, it seems like a pretty good outcome considering everything that could have happened.
Right, and you have to hand it to the media. Um, Propagandistically, it's handled the thing perfectly. People literally think that, like, I don't know, Putin invited Merkel over and, I don't know, threatened her life with his Labrador
Oh, yes, of course.
retriever, and she could not do anything except agree to a pipeline. Like, it's so absurd. They asked for the first one and they asked for the second one, and in each case, it's not only because they needed more gas and because of their green policies at home. It was also because the very country that they're apparently supporting, Ukraine, uh, was siphoning off the gas. I mean, this is so old, and it's amazing. Nobody mentions it. And talk about like weaponizing Russia's weaponizing the gas. You mean like Russia is not going to actually support a state that has been supporting for decades, that America is now supporting, used as a tool against Russia? Like, why on earth should Russia support it? It's so preposterous, right? But they make it seem like this is just to weaponize Ukraine. It's like, I mean, yeah, it hurts you because it hurts Ukraine, and you want to use Ukraine against Russia, but like that's not why the pipeline is being built. The real reasons on the ground is that the EU is nearly like it's just a few 100,000 shy of, or a few million shy of a billion people, and Germany is a really big part of that economically. So that's not why. It's yeah, it's going to hurt Ukraine, but Ukraine has to answer for its role. But I would say that even in the best circumstances, going forward, I think a pipeline of this kind was inevitable.
Oh, certainly, and I really don't see what the alternatives were, and especially after Fukushima, when the Germans swore off nuclear power. Not that
Yeah,
I'm, again, I
good
don't
point.
I don't buy into the idea that nuclear power is this catch-all thing that will just solve all our energy problems. I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but I don't like the one-size-fits-all solutions. I'm rather pro-oil. I may or may not have financial vested interest in that. We're not going to get into that, but especially after Germany and many other European countries, but Germany in particular, swore off nuclear power after the meltdown at Fukushima, this more or less became inevitable because it's not like Germany is extracting its own oil. It's not like they have these overseas colonies that they can ship it in from. And of course, it's not like they can rely on Saudi Arabia or Iran or any other, again, foreign state overseas to provide these energy costs when you have a, a country like Russia that is just, a few bordering countries away. Because, like, I mean, like, there's two transitionary countries if you're talking about just land border through Belarus and Poland. Now, of course, with Nord Stream, they went over the sea with all of that into Denmark. But point being is, compared to how far away Saudi Arabia, Iran, the other Gulf states, and these other major oil producers, you might think the United States or places like in Latin America, like Venezuela, or I think even Brazil has a decent oil industry. Out of all the options, if you're a German, if you're in charge of Germany, you're going to bite the bullet regardless of your opinions on Russia, on Putin, on whatever, and buy the Russian gas because it's just more convenient that way. And I am curious to see what this does to gas bills come the winter because, of
Hmm.
course, winter is right around the corner. Come late November, December into January, people will be cranking up the heat because it's going to get cold outside. It's going to get cold for prolonged periods, the point where you're going to need that. And if this cuts energy costs in Germany and the European Union, I think a lot more people in Europe are going to suddenly care a lot less about whatever posturing, whether that's rhetorical or economic, against Russia than they may have even before. Because at the end of the day, while I'm not saying things like ideology and core beliefs don't matter, but pragmatism and your material needs play a very significant role. I would say just significant role. Of course, we have seen countries that are willing to materially and pragmatically harm themselves in order just to prove a point. One may think Ukraine is an example of that,
Hmm.
but point being is, at some point, a lot of people, a lot of even national leaders or international leaders are willing to swallow their pride and go with what is the most convenient solution for them. And again, I imagine that that was probably it. That I don't think this is going to be a turning over a new leaf where Russia will be on these great terms with Europe and they'll be integrated. But I do think it will be a, no pun intended, warming of relations between the two. Like I said, I don't think they're going to become best friends overnight or even at all. But I do think a lot of the hostility we've seen since the Crimea issue will slowly start to dissipate as time goes on that people will care less, especially with the American empire in retraction. Of course, they aren't the only force on the European continent pushing this anti-Russia sentiment, but I mean they're the primary force and the primary beneficiary of it. But as that starts to go, as America becomes less credible in the world, I think you could see the situation where things become, not friendly, but much less tense. Maybe a situation you had post collapse of the Soviet Union, early 2000s between Europe and Russia. I'd say like pre Georgia. So again, that's all long term speculation. But point being is, I think Nord Stream 2, as I've said before, is a watershed moment whose effect we will not see in the short term,
Hmm.
but in the long term, over these next few years here, I think people will start to realize that Nord Stream 2, in terms of European politics and inter European relations, and of course European relations with Russia, is probably one of the most significant things that has happened in the past several decades. I would say since, I mean, I put it up there, maybe this is a bit drastic, with the fall of the Soviet Union. I would say, in terms of significance, in terms of affecting European Russian relations and even inter European relations. And of course, this is all on top of the time where the European Union is nowhere as near as fragile as it was over the past few years, especially I would say it really reached its peak in 2019, 2020 with Eurosceptic sentiments. I'd say those things generally calmed down, but especially in a Europe that is so volatile right now, something that is, again, a cheap source of energy may help to stabilize the situation. I think may cause a lot of reconsideration among these European populaces and these European governments about, well, do we really like the direction we're going? Maybe it's time to reassess some things. If Russian gas isn't that bad, let's take a look at these other preconceived notions we've had, these other just the way we've been doing things, and let's just maybe reassess our situation. Again, I don't think this is all going to happen overnight. I think this is probably going to be over the course of the next decade or two when they come to these conclusions. But if Nord Stream goes off without a hitch after it goes into operation and everything goes smoothly, I could see some of these questions start to gain some momentum and finally being raised within the again next couple decades. And now again, I hate to put time frames on things because of how things have been with. Again, I always overshoot these time frames, and something I say, oh, we'll see a decade from now ends up happening 6 months from now. But again, point being is, I still think, although this isn't going to be like a best of friends sort of renewing of relations, it is a major renewing of relations, no less.
Yeah, yeah. We'll see how it goes. I do have two small tidbits of news from Europe, and particularly in that region. As long as we're still on Europe.
Oh, certainly. Well,
As some people might already know, Poland is building a wall to stop migrants that are flooding into Poland vis-a-vis Belarus. Belarus is basically saying, your actions last year have consequences, and migrants are a consequence. So it's interesting that the now border wall is going to be constructed, and it's going to be very similar to the one that Hungary constructed. And the other bit of news, about 2 weeks ago, Lithuania had some protests against essentially COVID lockdowns and the possibility of COVID passports, vaccine passports. Well, another protest is being planned. I believe it's this weekend. Now, there was a disagreement between the government and the protest organizers. The government suggested that they should do it, basically far away, where it's not downtown, someplace where it's, of course, can be ignored and generally unseen. But the protest organizers have refused. They are going to protest in downtown Vilnius, and the nature of the protest is that they are protesting for family values. So this is yet another global homo rebellion, and
oh, so
we
we're going
we
to
know
see
that.
a no-fly zone enforced by France and the U.S. to put down these far-right radicals, right? Okay. Look, it's going to be okay. We're going to take care of these anti-NATO, anti-Western subversives, And it's all going to work out, and the rainbow flag will fly proudly over the Baltic Sea once more.
Oh yeah, I hate to say it, but that's where we're at. Yeah, so I think I think that's interesting. Things are ramping up there, and like I say, it's no, we've had a lot of examples of this, and we know that the rainbow flag is symbolic of something far, far more than LGBTQ. Now, I think they replaced the Q with an I
It's
now.
LGBTQ
Right.
CIA, okay? Well, it's always been, okay? But yes, with that being said, it is certainly an interesting situation that again you get this situation in Poland and the Baltics and a lot of these Eastern European countries that aren't necessarily on board with this LGBTQ CIA thing, and just the reactions of that, and of course with them being on the front line against Russia, it's much more tolerated, but it's only tolerated to a certain point. In terms of European news, in terms of migration, one of the other points is that Austria's prime minister Sebastian Kurz. Now you remember him of the tearing apart a coalition over a dubious story out of the press fame. Of course, he tore apart the right wing coalition with the. I believe the English equivalent is the Freedom Party, which is the more populist right wing party in Austria, where he's part of the center right party. And he formed some coalition with like this center left Lib Party and the Green Party. But even he is coming down after his 180, saying, well, no, we're not going to accept any more migrants. Migrants will not come to Austria, and it will not be a tolerated situation. And it's taking the strategy that Hungary will, where it's, well, again, not only are you coming to Hungary, but we're going to be a bulwark. It's like, yeah, you're not coming to Hungary, you're not coming to the European Union. This situation is not going to be tolerated. And that isn't a surprise considering the fact that you even get more centrist and liberal leaders at this point who are willing to go ahead with that rhetoric, especially in election years. We'll see how Macron reacts in the coming months as the migrant crisis likely intensifies. I imagine he will do what he did before and at least take a rhetorically stronger stance on the migration issue, but it does appear that across the political spectrum, we're starting to see this sort of rhetoric ramp up in Europe again. The liberal elites are not willing to make the same mistake they did last time. Now, that's not saying they all of a sudden care about their people or their demographics, but I think they realize the practical situation at hand that as much as they love these culturalist diversity states that take in people from all over the world, it just simply is not feasible.
Right. It's not, even though they still continue with the line that, if we can't change their country, then we'll just bring them into ours. In some ways, that's there to rescue the ideology, right? If the world is rejecting us, if we must go into retraction, right? If our, if the modern American manifest destiny, which can be defined by, ecologists, woke activists, militant homosexuals, like if it can, all of this stuff, like it aligns with like what used to be called white man's burden, universal values, and so on and so on. Like if you you can see there's a kind of potentially a kind of entrenchment that's developing, and so you know, I mean, you have the American establishment, Republican and Democrat, saying, we got to bring in as many as possible. So if like we can't create a state over there, it's not an indictment against our universal values. Maybe we're the only one who understand how universal this is, right? So, we'll bring them in.
Oh, certainly. Again, we'll get into some of the stuff about Afghanistan and with that and the refugee crisis there. But that's all the European news I had, so I figured we can move on to
Yeah.
Afghanistan proper, in which case the evacuations continue on all sides. Of course, you have the U.S. getting into further. I would say I wouldn't even know what word to put to it, but at the point where of course, yeah, we're still getting people out. We're getting American passport holders. They refer to them out. The French project that they will have completed their evacuation by next Thursday. You had various European countries, including the British and the Italians, mainly deploying their special forces to assist in this evacuation. You had statements coming from all over. Of course, Turkey said, we will stand strong, we will not withdraw from Syria, and then almost immediately recanting that statement. You have China making appeals towards the Taliban, saying that, well, look, we're willing to work with you, you just have to moderate a bit, you just have to clean up your act, and we'll get right on that, which is, again, as we discussed, even pre 2001, was a negotiation that was in progress. You, of course, have more Russian forces moved into Tajikistan, and you have the Russians really trying to take as hard a situation in Central Asia in general. Not necessarily Afghanistan. It's not like they're going to redeploy troops to Afghanistan anytime soon, but you had Lavrov coming out and saying that we don't want any American troops in Central Asia. They need to go home. Now that they withdraw from Afghanistan, they need to leave the region. And it looks like the Russians have really cracked a whip on Central Asia and are starting, especially on the border countries, especially in Uzbekistan and in Tajikistan, to a certain order there because they are still very concerned about some degree of spillover occurring during this, again, crisis. And you see on both sides the Tajiks are acting up because you have the Tajik population within Afghanistan, which makes up the bulk of the Northern Alliance, which has recently reorganized itself and declared that it is an organization that is willing to stand up to the Taliban government. And of course, you have inside Tajikistan's, again, calling on the Taliban to not necessarily step down from power, but they are, again, issuing statements that are not outright condemning the Taliban, but are not in favor of the Taliban either. So it does look like that's happening. It does look like the Tajiks are very concerned about the situation on the ground there. And of course, you have Washington coming out saying, well, we'll work with forces on the ground to get our citizens home, to get our passport holders home, but we're not going to negotiate with any militants. And I don't know how they, again, square that circle, but
Mhm.
I guess that is where they're at, the doublespeak of it. Of course, Biden is nowhere to be found. I believe he is on vacation again. I think he went back to Delaware. He went somewhere. I know that, but I know that Biden is currently out of town, so to speak, quite literally. So I don't know who is in direct charge of this situation. One may think Kamala Harris, but I wouldn't know either. But point being is, okay, the American regime, so to speak, says they won't negotiate with these militants, calling back that Bush era rhetoric. And I mean, at least I'll say in the Bush era, it came from a position of perceived strength. It wasn't a complete joke because when that kind of statement gets issued now, when they have you surrounded, when they have your embassy and your McDonald's surrounded, and you're saying, "Oh, well, we can't negotiate with them," it really is just an empire in shambles, is it not? And really, you see the Taliban trying to do this international push. Now, people joke about, like, of course, like, they have the official Twitter account and the Twitter representatives that are posting these memes there, but they really are trying to do this overture to the international stage, trying to polish their reputation in order, again, to attract outsiders and outside investment, particularly China, as you can see, and to, again, keep the world at bay, keep it from Afghanistan from becoming a pariah state as it was in the late 90s and early 2000s. But it looks like beyond the current bungled evacuations, and I would say, even going beyond this, that it wouldn't have mattered who was in office with the United States because I think we've seen by the state of the French evacuations and even the British evacuations, which have gone marginally better than ours, that it is just a situation that is a systemic failure, not only the United States, but of the entire Western sphere in general, to the point where they thought they could meander their way out of Afghanistan. They thought they had a few months or, a year before the Taliban finally showed up and took control of the country, but it was within a matter of just weeks, and they were proven wrong on that. And again, you still have this insane situation on the ground where you have all these foreign personnel who are trying to be evacuated from the country. And on top of that, we are making sure that these poor refugees who are all conspicuously men who are like ages 18 to like 35, the bulk of refugees, the people who definitely wouldn't be participating in combat or war. No, not at all. It does seem strange, and again, I'm not trying to do the appeal that, well, oh, of course we should be nice, blah blah. Like I, I'm frankly at the point where I think it would be insane for any country to take in, again, any of these people, whether they're men, women, children, no matter like what ethnic group they are. But it is rather conspicuous that every migrant crisis we have these middle-aged men who flee the country, and one could say, oh, maybe they're just cowards, maybe they don't want to fight or whatever, maybe they have no loyalty to their people. And I'm not even trying to go into some big ring conspiracy, but maybe these are the people who really have no direction, no purpose in life, who are wanting some what one may call retribution. I mean, look at how many of these people end up being involved in terrorist attacks. I mean, you have the 2015 attack in France, um, again the attacks in London, the truck attacks that happened all across Europe, particularly in France and Germany. Again, it's easy to write these people off as like, oh, they're just men fleeing because they're cowards and have no loyalty to their people. But honestly, I'm sure that some of them, I'm sure that's a lot of them. But I do think it overlooks, just in terms of the refugee question, how many of these people have just have nothing else going for them in life, so they're going to take down a few of their perceived enemy while they can. I mean, but that's more of a tangent about the situation in Afghanistan. But point being is, we are on an impending migrant crisis yet again. It looks like Turkey has been negotiating with the Iranians to try to keep Afghan refugees out of Turkey at this point. And again, you still have Turkey dealing with what, several million Syrian refugees, and you look at that. That's the entire point of their campaigns into northeastern Syria, into the SDF-controlled Syria. They're really just trying to create a zone where they can put these Syrian Arabs back into their own country and be free of this burden. And as they're slowly but surely actually succeeding at that with their occupation zones, you have the impending threat of several million more refugees coming into the country. And again, it does create this question of what to do with all these people. And we did touch on this slightly before the fall of Kabul, the episode we did before that. With all of that, and again, what you see now is, of course, Central Asia doesn't want them. Um, Iran, I guess, will tolerate them. Uh, the West is taking a hardline stance. Of course, you have voices in the U.S. and trying to say, oh, we need to resettle these people. But again, it really is a powder keg of these millions of people who have been displaced by, again, not only the takeover of the Taliban, but 20 years of failed policy in Afghanistan. I mean, is Pakistan going to take even more, as they did during the Soviet invasion, as they did during the subsequent Civil War and American intervention into the country? It does. It really, I have no idea what or where these people are going to go. I can only tell you it is going to be frankly, a disaster no matter how it turns out. I really don't see a good solution here. It's just going to be, well, who is going to take this blow for everyone else? And at that point, I don't know, because all parties seem pretty unwilling to budge, unless you want to create, again, a strong border that is a containment in Afghanistan, where you just, again, seal the Afghan borders from the other side, which, who knows, the situation could get desperate enough where neighboring countries such as Iran, such as Pakistan, such as Tajikistan begin to do that. But, I mean, time will tell, I suppose, but people are desperate, I would say for very understandable reasons, to keep this spillover contained and keep it from actually moving into Afghanistan proper.
Right. So, there's been a kind of back and forth about will the Taliban allow people to leave after the 31st? Now, up until really this afternoon, the Taliban was saying that it would not. It wants its citizens to stay, particularly those who are well educated, because their talents will be needed in order to reconstruct the country and move forward. But I did see some headlines today and some text indicating that they are going to allow individuals from Afghanistan to leave after the 31st. I don't know how much of this has to do with, let's say, Britain and France right now. Sorry, not so much France, but Britain and the U.S. kind of indicating in their pressers that they may not be able to get everybody out. Now, the U.S. is about 1,500. Um, Britain says it has its own number, which it doubts it will be able to lift out of Afghanistan before the 31st. So I don't know if it's connected with that. And honestly, this is a very fluid and dynamic situation. So who knows? Really, in a few days, all of this can be retracted. Something else can come about. I do think they're going to stick to the 31st, and in a way, like you could argue that the Taliban has been generous. However bad the deal was that the Trump signed, and he made like a deal with the Afghan government and with the Taliban in February 20, and February 2020. The fact is this: Biden has known about this withdrawal. He has claimed he's wanted a withdrawal. He was against the surge when Obama was president, and so on and so on. And the fact of the matter is that, in many ways, every president has wanted to be the president that pulls the troops out of Afghanistan for political gain, right? Obviously. We'll get to Blair later on, but there's a lot of slogans, like Forever Word, that have resulted from that. And so, I think Biden has only himself to blame because he knew what the stakes were. He did change the deal from May 1st to August 31st. He has been given an extra 4 months to do this. He bungled it himself by removing thousands of troops and basically not closing down, but leaving Bagram Air Force Base. There are literally hundreds and thousands of vehicles, both military that are ground and air-based, that now are Taliban hands. Even Sweden volunteered to have its jets blow them up, which is, I find funny because, Sweden had no idea that the U.S. was going to pull out. And so it left its embassy without taking anybody. Exactly what Canada did. In fact, Canada took its employees and its embassy and its forces. It evacuated them a week before Kabul fell. Now, I'm sure they've brought some troops back in, but that lets it was on Biden to work with, his allies. They've consistently tried to make this sound like people are arguing about whether to stay in Afghanistan or not. But over and over again, people have had to clarify that, no, it's about the pullout. And this kind of gaslighting that his administration has been doing has not worked. And, we don't know how many Afghanis are going to flee right now. 1 million is not, I think, unreasonable to guess.
Oh, certainly. I think that's a rather reserved, conservative estimate, if anything. I mean, what was it you got out of the Soviet invasion? That was like 2 million that got driven out, or even more. I think that might have been. But again, this is just it does make you wonder: is it going to get to the point where are the neighboring constituent countries just going to seal their borders and refuse to let these people in? I mean, that's really the only viable solution I could think of that wouldn't be a disaster anywhere else, because, of course, a lot of people are going to be desperate to get out of Afghanistan, but what's going to happen when the immediately neighboring countries say, you're not coming in? I mean, you already had that happen in several of these other Central Asian countries. The Iranians and the Pakistanis, I don't believe, have made such a statement, but I don't know, maybe it does it does make you wonder: are we going to see possibly this march to the sea, march to the Indian Ocean, and have these NGOs smuggle
Hmm.
them wherever? But I mean, again, it's there's so many questions that are unresolved that are up in the air about this that I mean, it's easy to blame Biden or the U.S. or whoever, but looking at it, this is really inevitable. I would say since after what 2015, and even then. But if you would have withdrawn, I would
Yeah.
say either immediately after Bin Laden or within the few years after that, when Al Qaeda especially was on the run, but the Taliban was pretty resurged. But in strange sort of irony, the U.S. presence there, I suppose it was needed to justify the presence, since the assassination of bin Laden had only made the Taliban a stronger force. The point where again they only gained more favor in the Afghan public, and that was a hard feat to do. Now, sure, many of these people in Afghanistan are tribals who live their life, don't go outside of 10 miles in their village for most of their lives, if ever. But a lot of these people still have bitter memories from the 90s, from the Civil War, from what the Taliban did to a lot of them. Now, of course, there has been a restructuring, a rebranding that has really allowed the Taliban to take control of the country, a much more hands off approach with these local groups. Of course, one of the big reasons you saw a surge in Taliban is just these local tribal leaders and local militant leaders would just say, "Oh, of course we're affiliated with the Taliban," when that's the way the wind started to blow. And it does make you wonder about their loyalty as things start to falter. Will they be the first? They'll likely be the first ones. I'll just say outright to be. Oh, of course we're part of the Northern Alliance. We're part of X, Y, or Z resistance group, and we're the ones who've been standing against them this whole time for whenever the next power wants to come in and fulfilled their dreams, which will likely fail. Have their failed dream in Afghanistan, so to speak. And again, I still think it's too early to be talking about that, but what I've said as the withdrawal has happened, I could see very easily a brief so called peace before, again, factional, at least tensions, I wouldn't say outright fighting breaks out again because it's not like fighting has stopped. But I do think you get the situation that you get in Lebanon and in Syria where nobody's going to want to fire that first shot. Now, I think in Afghanistan, they're much more likely to fire that first shot, but I still think it is a difficult prospect if you get militant groups or tribal groups declaring themselves against the Taliban government or declaring themselves part of X, Y, or Z organization. I think bullets are more likely to fly in Afghanistan than in the aforementioned countries, but it's still going to be a hard sell for either side to pull that trigger first.
Yeah. Um, Afghanistan, like, I mean, it's been a place of great ambitions and great desires and great failures. I remember way back, and now when 9/11 happened, like, because the media was a lot freer then, you would find out all kinds of tidbits of information. So, like, I remember after it happened, you're just learning about the Taliban, and then you find out, like, oh wow, the Taliban came to America in '97, to talk about a pipeline, right? And like, wow. And then you read about Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard and how pivotal this region is. Um, and so the U.S. has been busy there trying to stop pipelines from developing or constructing their pipelines, but it's been elusive, and it hasn't worked. The closest thing to it is, and of course, China has ambitions, I think, for a pipeline there. It can safely be assumed. Um, but uh, China does have a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan to Uzbekistan to China, and it goes to the Xinjiang province where the Uyghurs are. And now they want something similar like that, probably using Iran. and Pakistan and India could be included. This is what they called back then TAP or TAPI. Um, so that would be Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. But that will likely be changed given the differences now from 25 years ago or 20 years ago in the geopolitical situation. Um, so, the other thing that I've also heard on some dissident right chats is like I have not been able to find any credible source that said in the agreement the Taliban has to maintain the poppy fields. In fact, there's explicitly states that no poppy fields and their proceeds will go to funding any kind of terrorism. And you remember when the Taliban took over the the president's office in Kabul, one of the statements that they made very early on is that they would not allow Afghanistan to be become a narco state. And we know that a lot of money was used, black ops, basically funding.
Yeah, particularly the CIA intelligence agencies are the big ones who,
yes,
again,
and
gain their capital that way. And I think I know where you're going with this about like, well, if this source of revenue gets cut off, what are we going to use to supplement it?
Right, in the same way that cocaine was used in the 80s in Nicaragua and El Salvador, right? So they had all these cocaine sales from Colombia and all that whole region. And, they got caught in doing that. And, before then, for instance, I don't know if it was Burma or not, but the Chinese nationals that lost against the communists, they went and started growing heroin in what they call the Golden Triangle there with Thailand and Laos. So, these big productions have been used in the past. And like you say, where to next? Because it's a vastly different kind of chessboard now than it was 20 years ago.
And I was speculating. I was speculating in terms of that with the current dynamics in Southeast Asia, with Vietnam cooling relations with China. Are we going to try to cut some sort of deal in Southeast Asia again to keep the opium flowing out of there? Are we going to start, smuggling cocaine back in from Latin America? It raises so many questions because Afghanistan was such this massive hub of opium, and not only in terms of course, buying and selling it in order to raise funds for Black Ops, but in terms of pumping it into places like Russia and Europe as a whole, inconvenient countries,
right.
if you
and
will.
That was the thing.
Yeah. So, and with that being said, like especially Afghanistan, Central Asia, getting it pumped into the former Soviet Union mostly, it seems like that's gone. It seems like again, unless the Taliban does some 180 again, but in terms of the drug revenue, where's it going to come from, or like what are they going to start smuggling? Who knows? And again, I think this is going to create a bit of a budget crunch for groups like the CIA. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be completely like I'm not saying they're going to be destitute because of this, but they're going to miss out on quite a bit that they would have before, and I think they're going to be very desperate to pick up the situation. And as you were saying, well, Myanmar's off the table, but what I'm thinking is, are they going to ramp up protests there? Are they going to ramp up the color revolution there in order to open that market back up? And I mean, we already saw that happening, end of last year, beginning of this year, where you had these protests in Myanmar, when you had these uprisings and trying to overthrow the military dictatorship. You had protests in Thailand last year. So are they going to take these resources, especially with it being in the proximity of China, and dump it into color revolutions and, again, anti-regime activities in these Southeast Asian countries, I would say particularly Myanmar and Thailand, in order to open up those markets again? I would say that's probably the most likely thing they could do, unless they really want to try the debacle of, coke smuggling out of Central and South America again, which I mean, the dynamics there have completely changed. I'm not saying that things have stabilized there, but in terms of the dynamics, again, in Latin America, I would say it'd be a much more difficult prospect than it would be in than it was in the 1980s. And I would say Southeast Asia, particularly, again going back to Thailand and Myanmar, are probably the most likely candidates to make up for this loss of revenue.
Right, right. One of the things Pepe Escobar said in a recent article about that, um, he said that to go back into the Golden Triangle area, that that area around Indochina, so to speak, um, would be difficult because, like I said, they're very different places right now, and it's more difficult to establish that. So what they would have to do is actually look to very various minorities, which kind of speaks to what you were saying, to get various minorities within those countries to grow the poppy seeds, and then that in itself could destabilize those countries. So that's possibly an option. Possibly we could see the northern part of South America and Central America. Maybe it'll be used to apply pressure on Venezuela, because I think Venezuela might be a place that we'll see in the next year getting hot all over again.
Oh, absolutely. And again, that is a certain sort of situation that has changed drastically, especially with the what are we at 3 or 4 failed different regime change attempts in Venezuela at this
Mm-hmm.
point.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't imagine, especially after everything, that they're going to pull the successful one out now. Now you could look at Mexico with how much the cartel violence is going on there. Maybe that will be the hub, and especially being an immediate neighbor. Again, that comes with the
Mm-hmm.
pros of, well, yes, it's right there, it's right across the border, but it also comes with the cons of, hey, if we massively destabilize our southern neighbor, and you already even have Biden and his regime conceding that, well, yeah, maybe masses of people on the southern border, as much as we may like that in theory, maybe that is a practical problem. So you could get that problem. And again, that's also a thing with Latin America, where if you start to destabilize the situation, they're all going to flood north, and you can only handle so many of them. As much as they'd love to take everyone in, even these vampires realize that, again, you have to be pragmatic at some point. So, I mean,
Right. There's also
they're in a
the
bind,
possibility.
is really what I'm getting at.
Hmm. Yeah, they're not. Even the possibility of what's his name, Massoud, the son of the Northern Alliance leader that was killed just a few days before 9/11. The Northern Alliance grew this stuff. That's how they funded it, and um, but it doesn't appear to me, even though the vice president of Afghanistan has gone into that region. Was it the Panjshir? Even though that's happened, the Taliban says that they're basically surrounded, and that it's just going to be a waiting game. And so, if that's the case, then Afghanistan is not going to be the place where they can revitalize that. I imagine there's going to be great economic pressure. Now, the U.S. has said that they are not going to give the 9 billion or so in gold of that Afghanistan has in American central banks. That's that no access there. And this week, the WTO and the IMF have frozen all loans, despite Merkel saying that she's going to give 600 euros and then another 100 euros to help Afghanistan. And today, Afghan banks have switched back on. They were off for days. So you know it's hard to, I don't even think economic pressure is going to work. I think even back in the 90s and in 2001 it wasn't really working.
Well, I
If
think
we're
you're missing
talking
the
just
obvious angle
about
here.
poppy field eradication.
Afghanistan is going to be the first state to have Bitcoin.
Pardon me.
Afghanistan is going to be the first state to have Bitcoin as a legal tender. That's what we're missing here. Afghanistan,
It's amazing. It's
again, rare
amazing.
earth element mine, crypto mine.
It
What's the
it it,
difference?
and it,
But with that being said, that's all I had for today. Unless you have any last minute stories you want to bring up.
I did. Your voice actually went really slow and then really really quickly.
Oh
I
well,
didn't catch what you said.
well. Hopefully that doesn't show up on the recording. And welcome back to the technical difficulties report. It's nice to have you all here. It's a good thing we're getting close to the wrap up of the show. But point being, as I was saying, you know, uh, rare earth mine, crypto mine. What's the difference? So I suppose
Yeah, I
that
mean,
that's
in many
that's
ways,
what's worth repeating. But do continue.
in many ways, also judging by the memes, Afghanistan really is the alt right country. I sorry, I just couldn't resist. But the other thing I wanted to talk about with reference to Afghanistan is Tony Blair, and
Ah, the
like
the
I mean,
the
now
Albanian man, correct?
sorry, you cut out again.
The Albanian man, Tony Blair.
Yes, the Albanian man, but no, I thought it was interesting. I know Tracy wrote an article about and the Duran had a show about how the British are living in fantasy land, and who does I mean even the Guardian criticized Tony Blair for his article that he had in the was it in the Independent or the Uh, Telegraph? So um, where he called basically America leaving Afghanistan over imbecilic um, you know jingo statements about the war was a huge mistake. And I saw the interview that he did for Sky News. I thought it was very interesting, actually. Um, I understand all those points. All those points are valid. That um, the Brits have been very upset that America is leaving. They're probably even more upset that they weren't warned about it. Biden didn't even phone Boris Johnson for more than 48 hours after the takeover of Kabul. Big mishaps. But I think what's interesting to me is that if you understand, who Tony Blair is. Tony Blair is extremely powerful. I think in many ways he's more powerful than who's ever prime minister at the moment because of his connections. And he's involved with all kinds of NGOs. He's even like the global representative or British global representative for the ADL. So he has his finger in many pies. And when they start, when he starts whining about like how this is going to look and what is this going to mean for the West and for the US and for the UK in the long run, um, I think it points to the kind of that maybe America leaving Afghanistan has more consequences for the UK than it does for the US. Um, that's that's the sort of reading between the lines that I did when I listened to the interview. Um, because all his reasoning, for instance, that Afghanistan is very different than it was 20 years ago. Um, in in some ways, that's true. They have cell phones, and there's more of them that can speak English, and that is a certain amount of soft power. But the fact is the country still folded very quickly, and the Taliban too has adopted cell phones and so on and so on and so on. Right? Um, I think what he won't mention is the kind of influence that China and Russia will now have in that region, and that in and of itself is troublesome for Britain.
Oh, certainly. In like many ways, I would say one of the biggest one is just a blow to credibility. And you often see this with the secondary players to these large empires, where it will be, at least at first, they're the ones who bear the brunt of the imperial blunders. Now, that's not to say it won't come home to roost soon enough, but in the more immediate sense, they're the ones who feel it. And I do think that you have a very good point with that. That's how it's going to play out. And really, I suppose time will just tell, and that this Afghanistan situation, as much as I think as we can wind it down, it just becomes a deeper and deeper subject every time.
It is. It really is. I mean, it's pivotal. Some people. I mean, I do too. I don't. No one knows how rapid it's going to be. When people say, "Well, is this another empire who's gone to the graveyard in Afghanistan?" America can lash out, and they can really destroy the entire world if it wanted to. Um, but the possibility of America having the kind of wars that it began doing, let's say from even the first Iraq invasion to you know Libya, I do think those are kind of done. And you could look at Iran's retaliation over Soleimani as, and the U.S. basically not doing anything about it, as maybe another example. A lot of people have thought, that war with Iran was inevitable, and yet it goes all the way back um, to Afghanistan itself, when Wesley Clark said that Afghanistan, we're going to go into Iraq, we're going to regime change 7 countries in 5 years, and a lot of Afghanistan was possibly a staging ground for an attack on Iran as well. And I think if any of this is really true, like if I mean he did say it, I do believe him. But let's say it's completely on the up and up. Then America did bite off more than it could chew. It was an incredible task to try to achieve 7 regime changes in 5 years. I mean, it really didn't. It kind of did 3, and it took it a lot longer than 5 years.
Yeah, that's I would say probably the most accurate description I would heard of it. And I mean, even 3 is a bit generous. I mean, if you want to consider Libya a success, which I suppose you go. I mean, even if you want to consider Iraq a success, or I mean, like, yeah, they got rid of the government, but in terms of regime change, but again, that's getting tied up in the semantics. But I mean, it really is just a proposition with diminishing returns. Just that as time goes on, as everything continues to unwind, the American empire becomes less and less effective. But like you said, what it has is that ace up the sleeve that these other empires did, which is thousands of nuclear weapons, in which we have speculated in the past that if things get really desperate enough, if we have a belligerent enough president in the office, and who knows, it could be Biden. I doubt it, but you never know. It could be just using low yield nuclear weapons in order to prove a point. Dropping it again. Just these first strikes, these preemptive strikes, show that yeah, I mean, we used them once, we use them again, sort of mentality. So, I mean, which can very quickly spiral out of control. I'm not saying I think that's going to happen, but it's it's certainly within the realm of possibilities. I would say moving into the late 2020s, as things become more desperate for the American empire, if they take too many more blatant embarrassments like Afghanistan. But it's all
Yeah.
very volatile situation to say the least. And really, I think all we can do is just continue to, again, to quote a wise man, monitor the situation. But that's all
Yeah,
I
I
had
mean,
for this week. If you have anything else.
yeah. No, that's all I have.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report. We'll hopefully have Vile Varangian on Saturday. We'll see how that goes. For him to tell us all his opinions on the current state of Russia and, of course, the areas surrounding, and just his opinions on the issues that we give you every day. We bring him on about every 6 months. We're actually running a little late this time, but he'll be back, sure enough. But until then, we'll see you guys then, and goodbye.
Take care.